In the quiet, mundane life sometimes lie the most extraordinary and harrowing stories. The name of Velma Barfield forever changed the narrative of crime and punishment in the United States. Her life story reads like a tragedy that challenges our perception of evil. Known to many as the death row grandma, she became the first woman executed by lethal injection in the United States, the first woman to be executed after the death penalty's reinstatement in 1976, and also the first woman executed since 1962. But how did a wife, mother, and grandmother, once cherished and loved by those who knew her, transform into one of the most notorious figures in criminal history? Born in a time of economic despair, in the shadow of the Great Depression, Velma Margie Barfield came into the world on October 29, 1932, in Eastover, North Carolina, but was raised near Fayetteville. The second of 9 children, she witnessed a constant battle against poverty from the early age. In rural North Carolina, where life was governed by the rising and setting of the sun, Velma's family toiled on their small tobacco and cotton farm. Velma's father, Murphy Bullard, was a man worn down by the hardships of farm life. His temper was as volatile as the weather that dictated their fortunes. Velma claimed he was physically and sexually abusive to her and her sisters. However, other relatives disputed this. Velma's mother, Lily Bullard, bore the brunt of her husband's frustrations. In their world, love was a luxury they could hardly afford, leaving Velma and her siblings to navigate a childhood marked by emotional absence and the ever-present threat of violence. At a young age, Velma observed the financial differences between herself and her peers. That's when her first criminal activities started. She initially took small amounts of cash from her father to buy little things that she saw her classmates enjoying. Her petty thefts escalated to taking $80 from an elderly neighbor. When her father discovered that, he beat her severely, and Velma stopped stealing for the remainder of her childhood. Raised in a Christian household, young Velma found solace in the pages of her Bible, clinging to faith in the turmoil of her home life. This early introduction to religion was a constant amidst chaos. Yet, as she transitioned to adolescence, the psychological scars left by her upbringing would shape the woman she would later become. The world around was convulsed by World War II. The war, though distant, exacerbated the hardships faced by her family and deepened the fractures within. Velma, like many of her generation, was forced to grow up quickly. Her dreams and aspirations were often overshadowed by the pressing needs of survival and duty to family. Yet it was during this time that her resilience and tenacity began to shine through, qualities that would define her in both commendable and tragic ways. As Velma stepped into early adulthood, her desire for a life beyond the confines of her home grew stronger. She dreamed of escape. At the age of 17, she dropped out of school. The search for love and stability led Velma into the arms of Thomas Burke, a union that promised freedom but instead brought new hardships. By 19, she had 2 children, a son, Ron, and a daughter, Kim. The family lived happily in Parkton, North Carolina, for over 15 years. Velma's life with Thomas seemed a hard-earned escape from the poverty and violence of her childhood. Everything changed in 1965 when Thomas got into a serious car crash and suffered head injuries. To cope with the intense pain and headaches caused by his injuries, he became a heavy drinker and drug user. His struggle with alcohol mirrored the demons of Velma's father, reigniting the traumas of her past. The cycle of abuse and neglect she vowed never to repeat began to encroach upon her own family. It was during these turbulent years that Velma's resilience was put to the ultimate test. The pressures of an unhappy marriage, the responsibilities of motherhood, and the patterns of her past weighed heavily on her soul. Velma started a job at a textile factory, but soon had to quit due to health problems. She underwent an urgent hysterectomy, which left her feeling insecure about her femininity. After the surgery, she suffered from debilitating back pain and turned to prescription drugs. What began as a means to cope soon spiraled into addiction that eroded her judgment and set the stage for the tragedies to come. Her journey was not a plunge, but a gradual descent, each step marked by an increasing desperation to maintain the illusion of control. On April 4, 1969, Velma had a fierce argument with her husband. Later that day, when she and the children were away, the house caught fire. Thomas, who remained inside, died from smoke inhalation, and the house was burned to the ground. Velma and the kids moved in with her parents. A few months after her husband's death, Velma started dating a widower, Jennings Barfield. They married in August 1970. One day, the couple had an argument, after which Jennings became mysteriously ill. On March 21, 1971, he died of a heart attack. Velma moved into her parents' home again. Soon after that, her father died of lung cancer. In the summer of 1974, her mother suffered severe stomach pain and was taken to the hospital. As she got better, she returned home. In August 1974, a man Velma was dating died in a car accident. On December 30th of the same year, her mother was taken to the hospital again with similar symptoms of a severe stomach illness. Doctors couldn't help her this time, nor could they diagnose her illness, and she died after 2 hours. No autopsy was performed. As mysterious deaths around Velma continued, her son, Ronnie Burke, said, "It's the saddest thing, but it seems like everybody my mother ever gets close to dies. How could the good Lord allow this to happen to a faithful Christian like Velma Barfield?" The financial strain of her addiction led to another unethical decision, forging checks to sustain her growing needs. But deceit has its price, and the trust within the community began to fray. Velma found herself trapped in a web of her own making. In 1975, she was convicted of 7 counts of writing bad checks and sentenced to 6 months in prison. However, she was released after serving 3 months. Upon her release in 1976, Velma took a job as a caretaker for the elderly. Initially, she worked for 94-year-old Montgomery Edwards and his 84-year-old wife Dolly in Lumberton, North Carolina. Montgomery fell ill and died on January 29, 1977. A few weeks later, in February, Dolly developed symptoms of a stomach illness similar to those of Velma's mother and died on March 1st. Velma then started looking after 76-year-old Record Lee, who had broken her leg. On June 4, 1977, Lee's husband, John Henry, began to suffer severe pains in his stomach and chest. Doctors diagnosed his condition as a severe stomach virus. He died later that month. Later, in 1977, Velma moved in with her boyfriend Roland Stewart Taylor, a relative of Dolly Edwards. He was a widower and tobacco farmer. One day, they were attending a Pentecostal revival meeting in Cumberland County. Suddenly, Stewart complained of severe stomach pain. He was taken to the hospital, where he died after a few days. The search for truth begins in the quietest of ways. A question, a doubt, a pressing need for answers. Suspicion grew in the hearts of those who had watched Stewart's health decline under mysterious circumstances. It was their persistence that first brought the authorities to Velma's doorstep, initiating a chain of events that would lead to shocking revelations. An autopsy was ordered. The investigation into Stewart Taylor's death was methodical. Each test, each interview, each piece of evidence added another layer of suspicion around Velma. In the world of criminal investigations, breakthroughs often come with a faint clue, a moment of intuition, a connection previously unseen. For the team pursuing justice for Stewart Taylor and the other victims, it came in the form of forensic evidence. Arsenic became the linchpin in unraveling the mystery, traces of which were found in Stewart's system. Before the autopsy results were declared, Lumberton police received an anonymous phone call, reportedly from Velma's sister, who said that Velma had poisoned Taylor and others. Subsequently, Velma was arrested on charges of murdering Stewart Taylor. After her arrest, the body of Jennings Barfield was exhumed, and traces of arsenic were found. The unraveling of Velma's carefully constructed lies began. The art of interrogation is delicate, a push and pull between investigator and suspect, each question a probe into the darkest corners of the human heart. For Velma, the questions posed by her interrogators mirrored the ones she had long avoided within herself. It was in this room, under the weight of evidence and the scrutiny of the law, that the walls she had built to separate her actions from her conscience could no longer hold as the truth clawed its way to the surface. In search of solace, Velma turned to a spiritual advisor. It was in this desperate hope for redemption that she found the strength to confront her past. For her, the path to confession was a journey back to her soul. With a voice tinged with regret, Velma began to speak. A torrent of truths, long dammed by fear, shame, and denial, flowed forth. Her confession became a source of deep, lasting pain for her own family, who were unwittingly caught in her web of deceit. The woman they loved and the horrible crimes she committed were now inseparably linked, challenging their notions of forgiveness and the very foundations of their understanding of right and wrong. She confessed to poisoning Montgomery and Dolly Edwards, John Henry Lee, her mother, Lillian, and her boyfriend, Stuart Taylor. Despite the fact that arsenic was found in Jennings Barfield's body, Velma denied killing him. The motive for the murders was stealing money from her victims to support her clandestine addiction to prescription drugs. She had also taken out a loan in her mother's name. Each of her tragic choices, made under the influence of pain, had a devastating impact on her destiny and the people around her. Faced with the threat of exposure, Velma took a step that irrevocably altered the course of her life. The path from one crime to another can often be a slippery slope. She found herself repeating the unthinkable. Every time, Velma went to her victims' funerals and seemed to sincerely mourn their loss. The burden of her secret pushed her further into isolation. Yet, the resilient human psyche, adept at self-preservation, often takes refuge in justification to shield itself from the unbearable truth and finds ways to rationalize even the darkest deeds. Every time Velma stole money from her victims, then poisoned them as they got suspicious. To the outside world, she remained a devout churchgoer, a seemingly caring nurse, and a loving family member. But her moral compass, once guided by faith, now veered into a realm of denial, caught in a constant struggle between the remnants of her conscience and the overwhelming desire to escape the consequences of her actions. She was forging checks on her boyfriend Stuart Taylor's account. Presumably, he discovered that. So she mixed an arsenic-based rat poison into his beer and tea, determined to maintain her secret at any cost. At the trial, Velma's defense pleaded insanity, but this was not accepted. She appeared cold and uncaring. She laughed at the prosecutor and even gave the district attorney a round of applause after his closing speech. The prosecution painted a picture of Velma not as the church-going grandmother she purported to be, but as a calculating murderer driven by darkness. She was the architect of her own fate, and her actions deserved the utmost penalty. The defense, in turn, sought to humanize her, portraying her not as a monster, but as a troubled soul ensnared by addiction, abuse, and circumstances beyond her control, highlighting her mental health struggles as a mitigating factor in her crimes. In the world of law and order, the truth is often more complex than it appears, inseparable from human emotions. Although she eventually confessed to 6 murders, she was convicted only of the first-degree murder of Stuart Taylor in December 1978. The trial jury found aggravating circumstances and sentenced her to death. For the victims' families, the verdict was an acknowledgement of their irreplaceable loss. A designated holding area for female death row prisoners did not exist at the time, and Velma was the only female death row inmate in North Carolina. So, she was imprisoned at Central Prison in Raleigh, in an area for escape-prone prisoners and prisoners with mental illnesses. Subsequently, a unit for female death row inmates was established at the North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women. While on death row, Velma was off the drugs and expressed remorse for the years that the pills had blurred her judgment and destroyed her moral compass. In the solitude of her cell, she began the arduous process of confronting her past. The nights were long, the faces of her victims haunted her dreams, and the silence served as a backdrop for her thoughts and regrets. It was during these moments of reflection that Velma faced the full magnitude of her actions, the lives she had taken, and the pain she had caused. Her conversations with the prison chaplain were not just about seeking forgiveness from a higher power, but about understanding the nature of atonement and the painstaking process of forgiving oneself. In jail, Velma confessed that she had never been a true Christian. Her Christianity had been a matter of form and gesture. Then, finally, while waiting for her trial, she genuinely opened her heart to Jesus and received forgiveness and salvation. She wrote in her autobiography, "All my life I was weighted down by my sins because I couldn't do better. It never occurred to me that Jesus really did pay the price. that Jesus alone bore the extreme punishment, death, for my sins, not just for my good neighbors. And even more glorious, Jesus is willing to be my friend even now. I can talk to him and he will listen. She became a devout Christian and spent her 6 final years ministering to other inmates. Velma, in her own way, became a source of support to them. Her involvement in spiritual activities offered her a sense of community and belonging that had eluded her for much of her life. Her extensive participation in the Christian community led to a campaign to have her sentence commuted from death to life imprisonment. She wrote letters to Governor Jim Hunt telling him that her born-again Christian faith should be considered as a mitigating factor. She received support from many Christians across the United States, including evangelists Billy and Ruth Graham. Ruth kept in touch with Velma by mail. Her victims' families, however, considered Velma's conversion a fraud and a ploy to save her life. To them, she was a woman who had killed their loved ones. Velma remained a loving mother and a caring grandmother. She enjoyed family visits every weekend and spent time with her children and grandchildren. Her new attorney, Richard Burr, said about her, "The person I saw was kind, sensitive, and loving. There was no hidden agenda with Velma. Whenever you were with her, she was who she was. From what I understand, that's how she lived her life in prison. So, from the very beginning, I believed that when she committed those crimes, it was not the Velma Barfield mentally and emotionally that I was seeing and getting to know." Burr believed that Velma's pre-trial evaluations were inadequate, so he turned to psychiatrist Selwyn Rose. Dr. Rose evaluated Velma in 1980 and testified in the state court. He said that she suffered from 3 disorders: a multiple prescription drug abuse disorder, an underlying personality disorder, and depression. However, Dr. Rose never felt as if he had put together a complete picture of Velma. As Burr had no license to practice in North Carolina, he now assisted Velma's new lawyer, Jimmy Little. As time was running out, Velma's son, Ronnie Burke, asked her if she had killed his father. She replied, "I'm sure I probably did." She couldn't remember clearly, but she believed that she had left a cigarette or a match in the bed and then closed the door, leaving her drunk husband to sleep in their burning house. She also admitted to the pastor who helped her write Woman on Death Row that she had murdered Jennings Barfield. Velma said she was glad that this was finally over because she was afraid that she was going to poison her grandchildren. She didn't know why she did it, but she did it, and it was not something she could stop. North Carolina's governor refused Velma's request for clemency and said that her victims had been literally tortured to death. Additionally, an appeal was made based on testimony from a psychiatry professor who asserted that she suffered from dissociative identity disorder. Professor Dorothy Lewis, professor of psychiatry at New York University School of Medicine and an expert in violent behavior, picked up patterns of manic episodes in Velma's earlier life associated with the development of a manic-depressive disorder. She said she had talked to Velma's other personality, Billy, who told her Velma had been a victim of sexual abuse and that he, Billy, had killed her abusers. The judge responded to this by saying, "One of them did it. I don't care which one." Velma's final appeal was filed on October 30, 1984, in the North Carolina Supreme Court, based on her being incompetent at her original trial due to her drug addiction. This appeal was denied in federal court. She told her attorney, Jimmy Little, to drop all appeals the day before she was executed, explaining that she wanted to die with as much dignity as the state of North Carolina will allow. Her last hours were spent in reflection and prayer, seeking comfort in her faith. As she was preparing for death, the famous pastor Billy Graham told her over the phone, "Velma, in a way I envy you because you're going to get to heaven before I do." Velma was executed on November 2, 1984, at Central Prison in Raleigh. She released a statement before her execution. "I want to say that I am sorry for all the hurt that I have caused. I know that everybody has gone through a lot of pain, all the families connected, and I am sorry, and I want to thank everybody who has been supporting me all these 6 years. I want to thank my family for standing with me through all this, and my attorneys and all the support to me, everybody, the people with the prison department. I appreciate everything, their kindness and everything that they have shown me during these 6 years." As her last meal, she chose a bag of cheese doodles and a Coca-Cola. She received final visits from her family members and friends. She wasn't scared and told one of them, When I go into that gas chamber at 2 a.m., it's my gateway to heaven." She was wearing pink pajamas for the execution. A stethoscope and heart monitor were taped to her chest. The wheeled gurney was brought to her cell, and she was fastened to it with straps across her body and legs. Then she was wheeled into the execution chamber shortly before 2 a.m. Crowds of pro- and anti-death penalty demonstrators gathered outside the prison. Some of the protesters accused Governor Hunt of refusing to show mercy and compassion, arguing that she could lead a life of value behind bars and help other prisoners. Richard Burr said, "Politics and death have been mixed up in this case." Inmates were banging rhythmically on the windows of their cells, waiting for the execution. About 80 people who were in favor of capital punishment cheered and applauded. The execution was carried out by 3 volunteers. One of the intravenous lines was a dummy, so that none of the volunteers knew which of them actually administered the lethal dose. Velma was declared dead at 2:15 a.m., 15 minutes after being administered the injection of procuronium bromide. Observers at the execution reported that she passed away peacefully, with no apparent suffering or pain. About 300 opponents of the death penalty stood in silent vigil, carrying candles that were extinguished as the moment of the execution passed. At 2:25 a.m., Velma's body was taken to a medical school by an ambulance. She had requested that her organs be used for transplantation. She was buried in a small North Carolina cemetery near her first husband, Thomas Burke. She was 52 years old. Singer-songwriter Jonathan Byrd, the grandson of Jennings Barfield and his first wife, wrote a song about Velma. Do you believe Velma should have been granted a life sentence because of her religious conversion, or did she deserve the execution? And what would your last meal be? Tell me in the comments.